Welcome back to the channel. In this three-part build series, we're going to talk about the design and the build of a wedge top camper for a Ford F-150. Before we dive into our custom build, let's look and see what's out there commercially. Here's your standard truck cap. The challenge I have with this design as a 6'4" individual, I don't fit well laying down in a 5.5 foot bed. Here's Project M by 4-Wheel Camper. A lot of pros on this camper. It's very professionally designed. They really kind of thought of everything. Some of the cons for me are that I don't specifically like how boxy this area is. I wish it kind of leaned more in. I understand why they made it boxy to kind of maximize the space, but I definitely would fit in the top. Here's another design similar to 4-Wheel Campers. This is by AT Overland, and this is the Summit Topper. But you can see how the design kind of more in plane here, so it's not so boxy, and they still have the upper sleeping area. So here's another example by Go Fast Campers. If you scroll down their website, you can see that they have a camper top for pickups. And this is shown at Tacoma here, but I believe that they also sell Ford F-150s. This is the mental template that I like for the design for my Ford F-150. I like the fitment to the truck. I like how it's very sleek. It kind of fits the angles of the truck, and then the wedge top maximizes kind of the sleeping area. So some of this DIY has already been done by Ripcord. I recommend that you visit his Ripcord HQ and look at his DIY camper info. And you'll find a lot of information here about how he built his camper for his Tacoma. Ripcord's design was for his Tacoma, and the fitment was awesome, and the function was just like the Go Fast Camper design. One of the things that Ripcord did extremely well was choosing materials and the techniques to assemble, and he shared a lot of this in his videos. So I borrowed a lot of those techniques and tips from Ripcord, but then at the same time the fitments for my Ford, so there were some challenges that I had that made it a little bit different. In addition, I had a few design changes that I wanted to incorporate. For example, my wedge top width is a little bit wider because I wanted to maximize the space that I had and almost get a full queen size bed. And of course my fitment is to a Ford F-150. Let's address why you would want to do something like this as a DIY project. Number one is the cost. I purchased most of the materials pre-COVID, and at that time the cost of materials was about half the price of a brand new system. And of course I have to invest sweat equity, but that's okay. So number two is you get to have your own custom options. I already talked about having an F-150, and I wanted the fitment to match my F-150. So I wanted the angles to look sleek, and I wanted the height to match my over-the-cab height that I have for my F-150. So with a custom DIY, I could do all of that. Another important constraint is I wanted to maximize the bed space that I got in my wedge top. And as a final custom design consideration, I want my wedge top to be removable and replaced by a slim top. So I could go from over the cab wedge to just kind of the backside having like a standard cap for your truck. And of course, since it's a DIY project, you get an opportunity to learn new skills. And finally, just have fun with it. Get to enjoy your time building something with your own hands. All right, so let's talk about the design of this wedge top camper. A lot of people would reach for SketchUp or some kind of CAD, and I think that is probably the smart thing to do. But the way I thought about this project is that there's really kind of three rectangles that I have to get right. The first rectangle is the bottom that has to match and mate up to my F-150. So given the constraints of my F-150 bed size, this red rectangle, which I made out of 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch tubing, I could weld it together, and the dimensions are 68.5 by 69.5 inches, and that determines the bottom part. The second rectangle that we have to worry about forms the top of the cap. The top of the cap is constrained by the shape of the truck. I want it to be streamlined and lean in with the sides and lean forward with the cab. And so the dimensions of the top rectangle are 57 inches by 65 inches. After that, there's some steel that's connecting the top rectangle to the bottom rectangle. You can see that here. The third rectangle forms the camper wedge, and the camper wedge is constrained by materials again. The width is constrained by the panel size that I can get, which is 5 foot maximum width. It comes in 10 foot lengths, but we'll have to cut some of that off. The length of the wedge is constrained by the maximum length of the 80/20 that I can get, which at the time of this production, or at the time of that I actually made this, was 102 inches. And so the top rectangle has a size of 60 inches by 105 inches. The 60 inches is the width of the panel, and the 105 is the 102 max length of the 80/20 plus 3 inches, because it's 1.5 inches wide, and so there's 1.5 inches on both sides. So in my mind, the design is simple that way. The F-150 set the constraints for the bottom of the cap and the top of the cap. I want my design to be streamlined, so I'm kind of locked in there. And then the wedge is constrained by the size of the material that I can get. All right, so let's look at a cross profile from the truck, from the driver's side to the passenger side, say about midway in the bed. The 1.5 inch square tubing is going to sit on the bed rails. And again, we talked about that is constrained by the F-150 size, and that's 68.5 inches wide. At the very top, we can start to build the panel. Max width is 60 inches. And so underneath that, I can build my wedge. And the wedge is going to be composed of 80/20 materials. And there are two pieces of 80/20. There is a 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches piece, and that's part of the top that opens, and it pivots down by the cab side. And then at the bottom, there's 1.5 inches by 4.5 inches. And so this sandwich, the wedge sandwich, altogether is about 6 inches tall. Now to connect this wedge sandwich to the cap part, we need a couple more pieces. And so what I decided to do was use another 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches 80/20 piece, and I can use a plate to connect the wedge to the cap. This allows me to, at some point, remove the plates and swap the wedge for a slimline topper. The 80/20 piece here is connected to the steel, and there's a bolt that actually connects them, and the outside dimensions of between the steel pieces are 57 and 1 inch. And again, everything's 1.5 inches, so this extra 1.5 inches and that extra 1.5 inches add up to the 60. There are a couple of extra pieces that I weld onto the steel. The L brackets on both sides are to support the bed panels, and this little angle piece right here is so I can mount the side panels to the wind doors. The height between the bed, the top of the bed, to the top of this piece here is 24.5 inches, and again, that's constrained by the F-150. And then here you can see the wind doors, and they pivot around this point right here, and then they'll open all the way out so that they will project out at 90 degrees. Now let's look at the cab to the tailgate side profile. First, we see the 80/20 on the bed rails here near the cab of the truck. There isn't one on the tailgate of the truck because when you drop the tailgate, you don't want this cross member in your way. You want that to be open. But dimensionally, this is 69.5 inches from the cab side to the tailgate side. Next up are the top 1.5 inch steel pieces that form the top of the cab. We've seen the dimensions of these already. This is 65 inches by 24.5 inches. And again, this is constrained by the F-150 for the height. and the angle here is about 5 degrees leaning forward, and then the angle on the tailgate I chose so it was aesthetically pleasing to me, and I did that using a mock-up, which we'll see in a later video. Here you can see the extra pieces that I needed to weld on, again to support the bed panels and also to support the hinges so I can weld on the back door, which now you can see. So here's the back door, it hinges right here and it opens up. The front doesn't hinge, but it is connected directly to the tubing. Above that we can start to see the wedge pieces, and again the hinge point for the wedge is here, and so this piece is the 4.5 inch profile and this is the 1.5 inch profile, so this whole top piece opens up and forms the wedge for the wedge top camper. And again, dimensionally this is 105 inches, which was constrained by the maximum length of the 80/20 that I could get, which was 102 inches at the time. Now you can see in my design the whole wedge top is kind of shifted a little bit towards the tail side. It's not mating up exactly here. And so next you're going to see some additional pieces that I wanted to have in there. And so this is an extra piece of steel, and then I put an extra piece of 80/20 here to mount this top to. This extra distance is 9.5 inches in my design. My thoughts on shifting the camper wedge a little bit towards the tailgate, 9.5 inches here, was that I would have a little bit less material cantilevered over the cab, and I would gain a little bit of storage space here, so when I'm actually camping and the wedge top is open, I can empty my pockets or I can put other materials in this area. So this would be a 3-part video series. This is the first part, talking about the design, the background, the constraints, and how it was put together. The second video that's coming up soon is building the lower part, or traditionally the cap part of the project. And so that involves the welding of the tube, the size and the dimensions, some of the details on how the side doors work, and all of that. We'll build that in part 2. The third part of the video series will cover how the wedge top was built. Now the material using 80/20, it's like a big erector set, which isn't conceptually too hard, but there are some details in there that you're going to want to stay tuned for, especially around the tent fabric and how that connects, and connecting the wedge top to actually the cap. That'll be covered in the third part of the video series. If you enjoy what you see, be sure to like and subscribe.